Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into some stuff you sent us about the second coming of Jesus. We've got some excerpts from a YouTube video by a guy, John Bevere, and he really thinks it's important, like really important for Christians to get this whole event, you know? I'm really interested to hear what you think about this.
Well, the thing that jumped out at me right away was just how many Bible verses Bevere points to. He says there's over 2,400 verses on the second coming.
Wow.
Compared to only about 300 on the first coming of Jesus.
That's a huge difference.
That's a big difference, yeah. What do you think about that?
It really is. You'd think if it's mentioned that much in the Bible, it would be something that we as Christians talked about all the time. But Bevere's saying that there's actually like a lot of pushback when it comes to talking about the second coming, and even maybe some bad stuff that happens when we ignore it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
He uses this analogy of a house that's built on a shaky foundation. So if our faith doesn't have this understanding of the second coming, you know, we might not be as strong when things get tough.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And he also shared that story about the realtor.
Oh, yeah.
Who was like completely freaked out because he thought the world was ending back in 2021.
Right.
It just shows how like not understanding this can lead to fear and just not feeling very stable.
Absolutely. And Bevere contrasts that with, you know, the feeling of stability and peace that comes from really, you know, deeply understanding the second coming.
Yeah.
And he actually goes on to list like 5 main benefits of really digging into this topic.
Okay, so what's the first one?
So the first benefit he talks about is stability. Just the idea that, you know, Christ's return is coming, and that helps us stay grounded, especially when times are tough.
Yeah, I could see how that would be comforting, you know, especially when it feels like everything's chaotic.
It's like having this hope we can hold on to.
Yeah.
No matter what's happening. And then he connects this to a special blessing that's promised in Revelation 1.3 to those who read it, listen to it, and obey the words of the book.
So it's not just like passively knowing about it.
Right.
But it's really like you're taking the message to heart.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And letting it change what we do. This leads into the third benefit, which is purification. Bevere suggests that waiting for Christ to come back actually motivates us to live better lives because we want to be ready for him.
That makes me think of that verse in 1 John that talks about how we should purify ourselves just like Christ is pure. So it's like his coming back is like a driving force for us to become better people.
Yeah, it's like we want to be found blameless and worthy when he returns.
Right.
So then the fourth benefit Bevere talks about is wisdom. He says that studying the second coming helps us understand how we should live now, like in light of Christ's return and the times we're living in.
So it's not just about the future.
Right.
But actually about applying what we learn to our lives right now. What kind of wisdom does he mean?
He uses the story of Simeon from the book of Luke. Remember Simeon? He was the one who was able to recognize Jesus as a baby because he was so in tune with the prophetic timeline.
Oh, okay.
So Bevere is saying that if we study the second coming, we can actually develop that same kind of spiritual discernment.
That's an interesting thought, that by understanding the signs of the times, we can kind of become more aware of how God is working in the world.
Exactly. And that leads right into the fifth benefit, which goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning. Just how often the second coming is mentioned in the Bible. Over 2,400 verses.
Wow.
You know, clearly God thinks it's super important.
He's definitely not trying to hide it.
Yeah.
But if it is so central to our faith, why do you think it's so often ignored or even avoided in Christian circles?
That is a really good question. Bevere doesn't really address that in this specific video, but I think there are a few possible reasons why that is. You know, maybe some people find it just uncomfortable to think about judgment and the end of the world as we know it.
Yeah, it's not exactly light dinner conversation, is it?
No, not really.
And some people might be like afraid of getting caught up in speculation or even fear-mongering.
Right.
Like we see with some interpretations of the end times.
Exactly. And that actually leads perfectly into the next part of this deep dive, where Bevere talks about the dangers of ignoring the second coming and approaching it with the right perspective.
Okay, I'm definitely interested to hear what he has to say about that. I think we've all probably wrestled with those questions at some point.
Yeah, me too. I think it's something that we all think about. You know, it's a topic that makes us ask a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And maybe even feel a little anxious. But like we'll see, Bevere offers a hopeful perspective.
Okay.
And encourages us to be proactive in our faith rather than being driven by fear or just not caring.
Well, in that case, let's dive in.
So welcome back to our deep dive into John Bevere and his insights on the second coming.
In that last segment, we were talking about those 5 benefits that Bevere highlights.
Yeah.
And kind of got me thinking, are those benefits only for people who hold a very specific view of the end times?
Yeah.
Because you mentioned before that there are a lot of different interpretations out there.
That's a great question. Bevere doesn't specifically address different eschatological viewpoints, in this video.
Right.
But I think it's pretty safe to say that, he believes that understanding the second coming in general is super important for any Christian who wants to really live out their faith.
Okay, that makes sense. He also talked about the dangers of ignoring it. I think one of the most striking points he made was when he compared the Jewish people missing Jesus's first coming to Christians potentially missing the signs of the second coming. It's kind of a scary thought to think we could make the same mistake. Yeah.
It really is. It is a sobering thought. And he says that just like the religious leaders back in Jesus' time, they were so focused on their own expectations and traditions that they completely missed what God was doing. And we could do the same thing if we're not careful.
Right. It's like that spiritual blindness that he talked about.
Yeah.
What exactly did he mean by that?
Basically, he was talking about a kind of spiritual tunnel vision where we get so caught up in our own little worlds and our routines that we don't see the bigger picture, God's plan for the world and the signs that are pointing to his return.
So it's not enough to just know the facts.
Right.
It's also about being sensitive to what's happening spiritually.
Exactly. It's like, in the Gospels, when Jesus calls out the Pharisees because they couldn't interpret the signs of the times, they were so stuck on following the rules that they missed the whole point that God was breaking into their world.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And Bevere's saying that we could be making the same mistake today. We can get so busy with our own stuff that we might miss the signs of Christ's return. And he says those signs are all around us.
He does. And he makes it clear that this isn't just, an intellectual mistake. There are real consequences if we don't pay attention. He talks about how Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, which Jesus actually predicted would happen. And he says that happened because the Jewish people didn't recognize the time of their visitation.
Wow. So our response, or even our lack of response to the second coming, it could actually have serious consequences. It
could. There's a real urgency in Bevere's message. Like, he wants us to wake up and see what's happening and recognize the times we're living in. That's why I think that comparison to childbirth is so powerful.
Oh, right. Because even though we don't know the exact day or hour, we need to be prepared. Just like an expectant mother prepares for the arrival of her child.
Exactly. There's that sense of anticipation, getting ready, making sure everything's in order. But it's not about living in fear. It's about having a healthy sense of urgency and readiness.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely get behind that. I have to admit, though, that sometimes when people talk about preparing for the second coming, it can get a little intense. Like, they talk about stocking up on supplies and building bunkers and stuff.
I know what you mean. But Bevere's focus is really on spiritual preparation. It's about aligning our lives with God's will and being good stewards of what we've been given.
So things like, being holy and striving for peace with each other, being watchful in prayer, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what? That ties back to those 5 benefits we were talking about earlier. The stability, the purification, the wisdom. The more we think about the second coming, the more it motivates us to live in a way that reflects that belief.
So it's like a cycle, right? Where understanding leads to action, and then action leads to even deeper understanding.
That's a great way to put it. It's a positive feedback loop that brings us closer to God and helps us live with more purpose.
That makes a lot of sense. But I do have one more question about those 2,400 verses Bevere keeps mentioning. I don't think most Christians I know could even name more than a handful of verses about the second coming. Where are all those verses and what do they actually say?
That's a great question. It's true, the second coming is talked about throughout the entire Bible.
Oh, really?
It's not just in a few books or passages. You see it in the Old Testament prophets, in the Gospels, in Paul's letters, Peter, John, all over. It's not just about the book of Revelation, even though, that one gets a lot of attention.
So it's a recurring theme, like a thread that connects the beginning of the story to the end.
Exactly. The second coming is like the climax of God's plan for us, and understanding it helps us see the big picture of redemption and restoration.
That's pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
But if it is in so many places in the Bible, why do you think so many Christians aren't familiar with those verses? Is it just because they're scattered all over?
I think that's part of it, yeah. But I also think that the second coming can be a pretty complex topic. There's a lot of symbolism and imagery, and sometimes it's not easy to understand.
I get that, like all the stuff about trumpets and bowls of wrath and beasts with 7 heads. It can get pretty overwhelming.
It can be a bit intense. That's why it's important to, approach these passages humbly and acknowledge that we don't have all the answers. And I think some churches might even shy away from teaching about the end times because, it can be controversial.
Right, because they don't want to be seen as all doom and gloom.
Exactly. But Bevere really believes that we can't just ignore this topic because it's complex or maybe makes us uncomfortable. He sees it as essential for living a grounded and meaningful Christian life.
Okay, so where do we even begin? If someone wants to learn more about those 2,400 verses, what would you recommend?
Well, there are tons of great resources out there, commentaries, books, online studies. But honestly, the best place to start is just opening our Bibles and reading the passages ourselves. Praying and asking God to help us understand what it means.
That makes sense. And maybe not getting too hung up on trying to figure out every symbol or the exact timeline.
Exactly. Because, prophecy isn't really meant to give us a step-by-step plan for the future. It's about showing us God's heart, his character, and his ultimate plan for us.
Okay, that's helpful. So it's not about predicting the exact date of the second coming, but more about understanding what it means and letting that shape how we live now.
Yes, that's it. It's about embracing the hope and the motivation that comes from knowing Jesus is coming back, but without getting lost in fear or speculation.
That's a really important distinction. But how do we do that? How do we approach studying the second coming so that it's healthy and constructive, not something that makes us feel overwhelmed or anxious?
That's a great question. It's the perfect lead-in to the next part of our deep dive, where we'll explore some practical tips and insights for engaging with this topic in a way that builds our faith and strengthens our walk with God.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot in this deep dive. The good stuff that comes with understanding the second coming, the not so good stuff that might happen if we ignore it, and even some of the potential consequences. But as we start to wrap things up, I want to focus on the practical stuff. What are some actual things we can do to live in that state of readiness Bevere talks about?
Yeah, well, in the video we've been discussing, Bevere starts talking about what he calls the posture of the believer. It's not so much about a checklist of things to do,
right, but
more about developing a certain way of being, a heart posture that's in line with waiting for Christ's return.
Makes sense. So it's not just knowing all the facts about the second coming, but actually letting that knowledge change us from the inside out. But how do we do that? It all sounds a little vague.
He gives a few examples.
Okay.
And, they might sound kind of basic at first,
yeah,
but I think they're actually really powerful. He talks about things like living godly lives, trying to have peace with each other, being watchful in prayer, not taking advantage of others, and being filled with the Holy Spirit.
It's like he's saying, we should be living out the values of God's kingdom here and now, bringing a little bit of heaven to earth.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this so powerful. It's not just about escaping this world someday,
right,
but about changing this world right now through how we act and how we think.
That's really encouraging. It gives us a sense of purpose, even with all the messed up stuff happening in the world.
For sure, for sure. And I think it's also important to remember that we can't do this transformation thing all on our own. Bevere really emphasizes how important the Holy Spirit is.
Yeah, we can't just force ourselves to be holy.
Right.
It's the Holy Spirit that helps us understand the Bible, shows us where we're messing up, and guides us to do what's right.
Right. That makes me think of that special blessing that Bevere mentioned from Revelation 1.3. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near. So it's about engaging with the Bible through the power of the Holy Spirit. And that's what leads to real change.
It's not just filling our heads with knowledge, but letting it change our hearts and actions.
Exactly. And I think it's important to point out that there's a lot of debate and disagreement in the church about the specifics of the second coming and the end times. People interpret the prophecies and timelines differently.
Yeah.
And it can be kind of confusing, even divisive.
Yeah, I've definitely felt that, trying to figure out who's right and what to believe.
I think we all have. But what Bevere's saying, and what I agree with, is that even though we might have different views on some of the specifics, there are core truths we can all agree on.
Okay, so what are those core truths?
The basics are that Jesus is coming back. We don't know exactly when, but it will be soon, and we need to be ready.
So it's not about getting lost in the details, but about listening to the overall message and letting that shape our lives.
Exactly. It's about living with hope and excitement, not fear and anxiety. And I think that's where the Holy Spirit helps us again. He gives us wisdom and guidance when we're trying to understand these complex things.
And it sounds like humility is important too.
Sure.
realizing that we don't have all the answers, and being willing to learn from others, even if they see things differently than we do.
Absolutely. It's about honestly seeking truth and being open to having our minds changed.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope people listening will take away from this conversation?
I hope they'll want to explore the topic of the second coming more. Not because they're afraid or feel like they have to, but because they genuinely want to grow in their faith and relationship with God. Because that's what this is all about. Knowing and loving Jesus more deeply and showing his love and grace to everyone around us.
I love that. Letting the hope of Christ's return shape our lives today, not just our future.
That's it. And as we end, here's a final thought for you to consider. If knowing that Christ is coming back really has the power to change us, how will you let it change you?
That's a good question for us all to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going.